Sometimes the smallest mistake sends a message exactly where it was meant to go. The text was never meant for her. Daniel Carter didn't even look at the name on the screen when he typed it. His fingers were still smudged with motor oil, his knuckles rough from a 10-hour shift at Harper Street Auto, the kind of garage where the fluorescent lights buzz overhead and the smell of rubber and gasoline hangs in the air long after closing time. Outside, the November wind rolled down the quiet Ohio street, rattling a loose metal sign above the shop door. Daniel leaned against the hood of an old pickup truck, exhaling slowly as the last warmth from the engine faded beneath his palms. It had been a long day, the kind that started before sunrise and somehow still left him worrying about bills after dark. But that wasn't what was on his mind when he pulled his phone from his pocket. His daughter Lily had gone to stay with his mother for the night, something that happened more often than he liked to admit. Daniel worked late so Lily could have the things other kids took for granted, school lunches that didn't come from a dollar store, sneakers that weren't secondhand, birthday cakes that didn't come from a box. Every night, he sent her the same message before she went to sleep. It was a small ritual, something steady in a life that rarely felt that way. He typed the words without thinking. "I miss you." Then he hit send. The message left his phone with a soft digital whoosh, disappearing into the invisible currents of cell towers and fiber lines that carried millions of words across the country every second. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and grabbed his rag from the workbench, wiping grease from his hands as he walked toward the sink. He didn't notice the vibration in his pocket until a few seconds later. When he finally pulled the phone out again, he frowned. The reply came almost immediately. "I think you sent that to the wrong person." Daniel blinked. For a moment, he thought maybe Lily had borrowed someone else's phone. But the name at the top of the screen made his stomach drop. Victoria Hale, CEO, Hale Automotive Technologies. Daniel straightened slowly, his shoulders tightening as if the air itself had changed. Victoria Hale wasn't just anyone. Her company owned the electric vehicle prototype Daniel had spent all afternoon repairing. She was the woman whose face appeared in business magazines, the one whose speeches about innovation were quoted on the evening news. A billionaire executive who ran a company worth more than the entire town Daniel grew up in. And somehow, he had just texted her. Daniel rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "Oh no," he muttered under his breath. His thumbs moved quickly across the screen. "I'm so sorry. That message wasn't meant for you. It was for my daughter. I must have clicked the wrong contact." He stared at the phone, wishing technology came with an undo button for moments like this. A few seconds passed. Then the typing bubble appeared again. Daniel expected a polite acknowledgement, maybe a brief, "no problem," from an assistant who handled her messages. Instead, another line appeared. "You text your daughter that?" Daniel hesitated. The question felt strangely personal, coming from someone whose office probably sat 40 floors above a city skyline. He typed slowly this time. "Every night. She likes hearing it before bed." The screen went quiet. For a moment, the only sound in the garage was the distant hum of traffic and the soft ticking of cooling engines. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, in a glass tower filled with polished marble floors and quiet elevators, Victoria Hale had stopped walking in the middle of a corridor to read the message again. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain yet, she didn't put the phone away. The message stayed on Victoria Hale's screen longer than it should have. In the quiet hallway outside the executive boardroom, people moved around her in careful silence, assistants carrying tablets, analysts whispering about quarterly projections, the polished marble floor reflecting the soft white light from the ceiling panels above. Victoria stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her phone resting lightly in her hand. Every minute of her day was usually scheduled down to the second. Meetings, investors, interviews, decisions worth millions of dollars. Yet now she was staring at a single line of text from a man she had never met. Every night, she read the words again slowly, almost as if they carried a weight she had not felt in years. Across the country in the small Ohio garage, Daniel Carter had already begun cleaning up for the night. He turned the faucet and scrubbed the grease from his hands while the old radio on the shelf hummed softly with a late evening country station. His phone sat on the metal counter beside the sink, silent now, and he tried to convince himself the moment was over. CEOs had better things to do than text mechanics after business hours. Daniel dried his hands with a shop towel and began closing the tool drawers one by one, the soft clank of steel echoing through the empty garage. But his phone vibrated again. Daniel froze for a moment before picking it up. The reply was short. How old is she? Daniel blinked. The question caught him off guard. 9 years old, he typed slowly. She turns 10 next month. For several seconds, there was no response. In a glass tower hundreds of miles away, Victoria had resumed walking down the corridor toward the boardroom doors, but her pace had slowed. The people around her noticed immediately. Victoria Hale was known for moving through the building like a storm of purpose. Efficient, precise, unstoppable. Today she paused near the tall windows that overlooked the city skyline and read Daniel's answer again. 9 years old. She could not remember the last time anyone had described something in such a simple, gentle way. Her own childhood had been filled with private schools, formal dinners, and conversations about acquisitions before she was old enough to drive a car. No one had texted her good night. No one had sent simple reminders of love between meetings and deadlines. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she typed again. Does she know you text her every night? Daniel leaned against the counter in the quiet garage and smiled faintly when he read the question. Yes, he wrote. If I forget, she sends me a reminder. The reply came faster this time. What kind of reminder? Daniel looked at the cracked concrete floor for a moment as if Lily were standing right beside him. She sends me a message that says, Daddy, the rule still applies. Victoria frowned slightly at the screen. The rule? Daniel typed the next line with a small chuckle under his breath. The rule is simple. No matter how busy the day gets, we always say good night and I miss you. For a moment the conversation paused again. The fluorescent lights inside the garage flickered softly overhead, while outside the cold Ohio wind rustled through the dark parking lot. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket, assuming that was the end of it. But several states away, Victoria Hale had not moved from the window. The city stretched out below her like a field of glittering lights. Thousands of apartments stacked in glowing rows where people were finishing dinners, helping children with homework, and saying goodnight to families who expected them home. Victoria read the words on her screen again. The rule is simple. She did not realize how quiet the hallway had become until one of her assistants approached cautiously from behind. Ms. Hale, the board is ready for you. Victoria nodded once, but she did not walk toward the meeting room immediately. Instead, she typed one more message. Daniel Carter read the phone as the screen lit up again in the dim garage. The new message was only 4 words long. That is a good rule. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment, unsure how to respond to the most powerful businesswoman he had accidentally texted. But before he could type anything else, another message appeared beneath it. And then, after a pause long enough to feel almost personal, Victoria added one more line. Someone should have made that rule for me a long time ago. Daniel Carter stood alone in the quiet garage long after the message arrived, staring at the glowing screen as if the words might change if he waited long enough. Someone should have made that rule for me a long time ago. The sentence did not sound like something a billionaire chief executive would normally say. It sounded like something quieter, something older. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the dark office window, where his reflection looked back at him beneath the humming fluorescent lights. He was just a mechanic who spent his days tightening bolts and diagnosing engines that coughed and rattled through Ohio winters. The idea that he was having a conversation with the head of Hale Automotive Technologies felt strange enough already. But that last message carried something else. Not power, not authority, something closer to loneliness. Daniel exhaled slowly and typed back before he could overthink it. It is never too late to start a rule. He read the sentence once, before sending it, wondering if it sounded foolish. But a moment later the message left his phone and joined the quiet current of signals crossing the country again. In the glass tower downtown, Victoria Hale had finally stepped into the boardroom. The long walnut conference table stretched nearly 40 feet from end to end, surrounded by executives in tailored suits and glowing laptops that displayed graphs of revenue forecasts and production schedules. Usually Victoria commanded the room the moment she entered. Her presence alone could silence a conversation. Tonight was no different. The board members straightened as she took her seat at the head of the table, her posture calm and composed, every inch the leader investors trusted with billions of dollars. But her phone remained face down beside her notebook, and for the first time in years her mind was not entirely inside the meeting. As the chief financial officer spoke about expansion targets and battery production timelines, Victoria's thoughts drifted briefly back to the quiet mechanic hundreds of miles away who sent a message to his daughter every night without fail. The simplicity of it lingered in her mind like a soft melody she could not stop hearing. Her phone vibrated gently against the polished wood surface. Victoria lowered her eyes and read Daniel's reply beneath the table edge. It is never too late to start a rule. For a moment she did not speak. Around her the meeting continued, voices discussing markets and supply chains, but the words blurred together into a distant hum. Victoria lifted her gaze slowly toward the tall windows at the far end of the room where the city lights shimmered against the dark sky. Never too late. The phrase felt unfamiliar and strangely comforting at the same time. Most of her life had been built on deadlines and irreversible decisions. Opportunities came and went like trains leaving a station. Miss one, and the next might not come for years. Yet this mechanic from a small Ohio garage had written a sentence that sounded like a door quietly opening somewhere she had not looked in a very long time. Victoria typed a reply carefully, shielding the screen from the view of the executives beside her. Then perhaps I should begin tonight. Daniel had just finished switching off the final row of lights in the garage when his phone vibrated again. The building fell into darkness except for the faint glow of the parking lot lamp outside the window. He leaned against the doorframe and read the new message slowly. Then perhaps I should begin tonight. Daniel smiled faintly, imagining a woman in a tall glass office somewhere looking out over a city that probably never truly slept. He typed the next line without hesitation. The rule works best when it is simple. Victoria read the message almost immediately. What is the first step? Daniel looked up at the cold November sky outside the garage for a moment before answering. Step 1 is easy. You tell someone you miss them before the day ends. Several seconds passed before the typing bubble appeared again on Victoria's screen. She stared at the small blinking dots, suddenly unsure why her heart felt a little heavier than usual. Then she wrote back quietly, almost to herself. But what if there is no one to send it to? Daniel read the message, and for a moment the garage seemed even quieter than before. He thought about Lily asleep at his mother's house, about the promise he kept every night, and about the powerful stranger sitting somewhere far away who had never been part of a rule like that. Daniel typed one more sentence. There is someone tonight. You can send it to me. Victoria Hale did not answer right away. In the quiet boardroom, the discussion about production targets continued around her, voices steady and professional, but for a moment none of it reached her. Her eyes remained on the glowing screen of her phone, resting just below the edge of the conference table. There is someone tonight. You can send it to me. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a kind of warmth she had not expected from a stranger she had never even met. Victoria sat back slowly in her chair, while one of the directors explained a supply chain projection that stretched across the next 3 fiscal quarters. Normally, she would interrupt with questions within seconds. Tonight, she simply nodded once and let the conversation move on without her. Her attention drifted back to the message again. Across the country in Ohio, Daniel Carter had stepped outside the garage and locked the front door behind him. The night air carried the sharp chill of late November, and the faint smell of motor oil still clung to his jacket sleeves. The parking lot was empty except for his old pickup truck sitting beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp. Daniel leaned against the hood and looked down at his phone again, wondering if he had crossed a line by saying that. After all, Victoria Hale was not just another person scrolling through messages after work. She was the kind of leader who managed companies large enough to shape entire industries. But something about her last question had felt honest. Not powerful, not distant, just human. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before his phone vibrated again. Back in the boardroom, Victoria lowered her gaze and began typing slowly, her fingers moving with a care she normally reserved for signing contracts worth millions of dollars. Around her the meeting continued, but no one noticed the quiet moment happening behind the polished calm of her expression. She paused once halfway through the message, erased 2 words, and began again. Then she pressed send. In the parking lot, Daniel read the message as the cold wind moved across the empty street. I have not said those words in a very long time. He smiled gently, the kind of small smile that appears when someone recognizes a moment that matters more than it seems. You can say them now, he typed back. A few seconds passed before another reply appeared. Victoria glanced toward the window of the boardroom, where the city lights stretched far into the night like a sea of quiet stars. For most people, those lights meant home, dinner tables, families, conversations that did not involve stock prices or investor reports. For Victoria Hale, the lights usually meant more work waiting somewhere in the skyline. She lowered her eyes to the phone again and typed 4 words carefully, almost as if they were unfamiliar to her. "I miss you tonight." Daniel read the message slowly, letting the words settle for a moment. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a woman who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar projects had just spoken a sentence that carried none of that power. Just honesty. Daniel typed back without hesitation. "Then the rule is working." Victoria read the reply, and for the first time that evening the faintest smile touched the corner of her mouth. One of the board members noticed it from across the table and looked slightly confused. Victoria Hale was not known for smiling during financial meetings. But she quickly returned her attention to the discussion and closed her phone gently, sliding it beside her notebook as the chief operations officer began outlining the next manufacturing expansion plan. The conversation moved forward again, charts and numbers appearing on the large display screen at the end of the table. Yet something subtle had changed inside the room. Victoria listened carefully, asked a few thoughtful questions, and approved the next agenda item with her usual calm authority. But beneath the composed exterior of the woman who controlled one of the fastest-growing automotive companies in America, a quiet thought remained. Somewhere out there in a small Ohio town, a mechanic who worked late hours in a garage had just become the first person in years to hear her say those 4 simple words. And strangely enough, for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Hale did not feel quite as alone when the meeting lights reflected back at her from the dark glass of the city skyline. The boardroom meeting ended nearly an hour later, but Victoria Hale remained seated after the others had quietly filed out. The long table that had been filled with voices and financial projections now stood silent beneath the soft ceiling lights. Outside the tall windows, the city continued its restless rhythm, traffic flowing like ribbons of red and white beneath the skyline. Victoria rested her hands on the polished wood surface and stared at her phone again. 4 simple words still sat there on the screen. "I miss you tonight." She had written them almost without thinking, yet the moment had stayed with her long after the meeting resumed. For years her evenings had followed the same pattern. Meetings that stretched late into the night, followed by quiet elevator rides to a private office where the glow of computer screens replaced the glow of conversation. Success had brought power, influence, and recognition, but it had also built walls that few people ever crossed. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, someone on the other side of those walls had simply answered with kindness instead of expectation. Hundreds of miles away in Ohio, Daniel Carter climbed into his old pickup truck and turned the ignition key. The engine rumbled to life with the familiar low vibration he had known for years. The heater coughed once before sending warm air into the cold cab. Daniel rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before pulling out of the parking lot. The road toward his small house stretched through a quiet row of dim streetlights and dark storefronts. Most people in town were already home by this hour, finishing late dinners or settling in for the night. Daniel glanced at the phone resting in the cup holder beside him, the screen now dark, but still carrying the memory of the strange conversation that had crossed half the country earlier that evening. He did not fully understand why the moment had mattered to him either. Perhaps it was because the message had not come from someone trying to impress him or ask for something in return. It had simply come from a person who needed to say something honest. By the time Daniel pulled into the gravel driveway beside his small house, the porch light was already glowing softly. His mother often left it on when Lily stayed the night, a quiet signal that someone was waiting inside. Daniel stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door, the cold air brushing across his face as he unlocked it. Inside, the house carried the warm smell of chamomile tea and the faint creak of old wooden floors. Lily was asleep on the couch beneath a thick blanket, her small backpack resting beside her where she must have dropped it earlier in the evening. Daniel smiled softly and knelt beside her for a moment, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her forehead. Children had a way of sleeping with complete trust, as if the world would always be there waiting for them when they woke up. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and typed the message he sent every night. "Good night, Lily. Daddy misses you." The message sent quietly, even though she would not see it until morning. It was the rule. Across the country, Victoria Hale finally rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window of the empty boardroom. The reflection in the glass showed the familiar image the world knew well. A confident leader in a tailored suit, standing high above a city that never stopped moving. Yet tonight she noticed something different in that reflection. Not a change in power or status. Something smaller. Something quieter. She picked up her phone again and opened the conversation with Daniel Carter. The message he had sent earlier rested there like a small anchor in the middle of an endless sea of emails and corporate notifications. Then the rule is working. Victoria read it once more before turning toward the door. As she stepped into the quiet hallway, the thought crossed her mind again. Somewhere in Ohio, a mechanic had kept a promise to his daughter by sending a simple message before the day ended. And somehow that small promise had reached her too. For the first time in years, Victoria Hale walked toward the elevator with a feeling she could not quite name yet, but it was something close to peace. Morning arrived quietly in the small Ohio town, the pale winter sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor as Daniel Carter poured a cup of coffee beside the humming stove. The house still carried the gentle calm that comes before the day fully wakes up, a moment where everything feels slower and simpler than the world outside. Lily sat at the table in her oversized sweater, swinging her legs beneath the chair while she carefully spread strawberry jam across a slice of toast. Daniel watched her with the quiet attention that fathers learn over time, noticing the small things like the way she hummed softly while concentrating or the way her hair refused to stay tied in a perfect ponytail. His phone rested on the counter beside the coffee mug, silent for now, but the memory of last night lingered in his mind like a conversation that had not quite finished. Across the country, the morning looked very different for Victoria Hale. The sun rose between towers of steel and glass as the city began its daily rhythm of traffic and motion. Inside the upper floors of Hale Automotive Technologies, assistants moved quickly through the corridors preparing schedules and briefing reports for another day of meetings. Victoria stepped out of the elevator with her usual calm focus, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that matched the confident reputation she carried in every business magazine across the country. Yet something about her morning routine felt slightly different. As she walked toward her office, she glanced at the phone in her hand, the conversation with Daniel Carter still open on the screen. Then the rule is working. The message was simple, but she had read it again before leaving her apartment that morning. Not because it contained anything extraordinary, but because it reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten existed. A life that included small promises. Back in Ohio, Lily finished her toast and looked up at her father with bright curiosity. "Daddy, did you send the message last night?" Daniel smiled and nodded as he took a sip of coffee. "Of course I did. The rule still applies." Lily grinned proudly as if the rule were something very important, which to her it was. She reached for her small backpack and slid it onto the chair beside her. "Good. Because I checked my phone this morning and it was there." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head in amusement at how serious she looked about the nightly tradition. The world outside their kitchen window was beginning to stir now, neighbors starting cars and the distant sound of a school bus rolling down the street. Daniel glanced again at the phone on the counter, half expecting nothing unusual to appear. But just as he reached for his keys, the screen lit up with a new message. Daniel picked it up slowly, curious about the unfamiliar number that had appeared. The name above the message made him pause for a moment. Victoria Hale. The text was short, but it carried the same calm honesty as the night before. "Good morning, Daniel. I believe the rule might require consistency." Daniel laughed quietly under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief that one of the most powerful executives in the country had just sent him a message before most of the city around her had even finished their first cup of coffee. He typed a reply while Lily zipped up her backpack beside him. "Good morning, Victoria. The rule is very serious about consistency." Several states away, Victoria stood near the tall window of her office overlooking the busy avenue below. She read Daniel's response and allowed herself the faintest smile before setting the phone beside a stack of reports waiting on her desk. The day ahead would be filled with decisions, negotiations, and responsibilities that stretched across an entire company. Yet beneath all of that pressure, a small, unexpected connection had quietly formed between two very different lives. One belonged to a mechanic in a modest Ohio town who believed in simple promises. The other belonged to a chief executive who had spent years surrounded by power but very little warmth. And as the morning sunlight filled both of their worlds, neither of them realized yet that a single message sent by mistake had just begun to change both of their lives in ways neither one had planned. The day moved forward with the steady rhythm of ordinary life, but the quiet thread of conversation between Daniel Carter and Victoria Hale did not disappear. By mid-morning, Daniel stood inside Harper Street Auto again, sleeves rolled up as he leaned over the open hood of a silver sedan. The smell of warm metal and motor oil filled the air while the old garage fan turned slowly overhead. His coworker Jackson Tate wiped his hands on a rag and glanced across the shop. "You look like a man who won the lottery," Jackson said with a grin. Daniel chuckled and shook his head. "Nothing like that. Just a good morning." Jackson raised an eyebrow but did not press further. The shop radio hummed softly in the background while sunlight streamed through the dusty front windows. Daniel reached for a wrench and tightened a loose bolt with careful precision, but his phone buzzed lightly in the pocket of his jacket hanging on the wall. The vibration was small, yet for some reason he noticed it immediately. Across the country, Victoria Hale had just finished a meeting with the design division of Hale Automotive Technologies. The conference room slowly emptied as engineers gathered their tablets and presentation notes. Victoria remained seated for a moment, her gaze resting on the large digital blueprint displayed across the wall screen. Her company was preparing to launch the most advanced electric vehicle platform they had ever built. Every detail required focus and precision. Yet despite the importance of the project, her thoughts drifted briefly back to a small auto garage in Ohio where a mechanic had answered her message earlier that morning with unexpected warmth. She picked up her phone and typed again. Daniel stepped away from the car engine and reached for his jacket as the screen lit up. "Victoria Hale." The message read simply, "I hope the rule is still being respected today." Daniel laughed quietly under his breath before typing back. "The rule is always respected, especially before lunch." Victoria read the reply while walking slowly down the corridor toward her office. The polished floor reflected the light of the glass ceiling above, and employees stepped aside politely as she passed. She typed another message without stopping. "I imagine Lily will check again tonight." Daniel glanced at the phone and smiled. "She checks every morning too. Children are very serious about rules." The conversation paused for a moment as Daniel returned to the sedan and lowered the hood carefully. Jackson watched him curiously from across the shop. "That smile is suspicious," Jackson said. Daniel shook his head with quiet amusement. "It is just someone learning a new rule." Meanwhile, on the top floor of the Hale Automotive building, Victoria entered her office where the skyline stretched across the entire wall of glass. She set her phone on the desk and looked out over the busy streets below. Thousands of people were moving through their day without realizing that the woman standing above them controlled decisions that shaped factories, technology, and entire markets. Yet at this moment, the most unexpected part of her morning had nothing to do with business strategy. It was a simple exchange of messages with a man who reminded her that life could include moments that had nothing to do with profit or power. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel had sent another message. "By the way, the rule says you should also check on how the other person is doing." Victoria read the sentence slowly, then sat down in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "That sounds like a wise rule," she replied. Daniel wiped his hands with a shop towel and leaned against the workbench as he typed his next message. "It is simple. You ask one question." Victoria looked down at the screen. "And what question would that be?" Daniel typed without hesitation. "Are you having a good day so far?" For a moment, Victoria Hale did not answer. The question looked almost ordinary on the screen, yet it was something no one had asked her in a very long time without expecting a strategic answer in return. She stared out at the bright city skyline again before finally typing the truth. "I think it just became a better one." The afternoon light stretched across the garage floor in long golden lines as the day slowly moved toward evening. Daniel Carter stood near the open bay door of Harper Street Auto, watching the quiet Ohio street beyond the shop while the last car of the afternoon rolled away down the road. The air carried the faint scent of warm pavement and engine oil, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked behind a wooden fence. Inside the garage, the tools had been put back in their drawers, and the soft hum of the old radio filled the empty space. Daniel wiped his hands with a clean cloth and reached for his phone again, almost without thinking. The conversation with Victoria Hale had lingered in his thoughts throughout the afternoon, not as something dramatic or life-changing, but as something unexpectedly steady. A reminder that even people who lived in completely different worlds could still understand something simple. Across the country, the city skyline had begun to glow as the late afternoon sun reflected off the tall glass towers of downtown. Victoria Hale stood beside the wide window of her office, reviewing a set of financial projections displayed across the tablet in her hand. The numbers were impressive, as they often were. Hale Automotive Technologies had grown faster than almost any company in the industry. Investors admired her discipline and precision, and her name appeared regularly in lists of the most influential executives in the country. Yet despite the constant success, the office around her still carried a certain quiet that no financial victory had ever changed. Her phone rested on the desk beside the reports, and after a moment she set the tablet aside and reached for it again. Daniel Carter had sent another message. The rule also says something else, it read. Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly before typing back. I am curious about this rule now. Daniel leaned against the workbench as he wrote the reply. It says you should say something kind before the day ends. Victoria read the message slowly, a faint, thoughtful expression crossing her face. In the world she lived in, conversations often revolved around strategies, negotiations, or performance. Kindness was not usually listed on meeting agendas. Yet the mechanic in Ohio had somehow turned a mistaken message into a quiet routine that felt strangely grounding. She typed back carefully. What kind of kindness? Daniel smiled as he read the question. The simple kind. You remind someone that they matter. The words stayed on Victoria's screen for several seconds. She looked out across the city again, watching the evening traffic slowly begin to thicken as people headed home. Somewhere far below her office window, families were gathering for dinner, parents were asking children about their day, and friends were meeting for quiet conversations that did not involve business reports or shareholder expectations. For a moment, Victoria wondered how different life might have felt if she had built more moments like that into her own routine. Her phone buzzed again before she could finish the thought. Daniel had sent another message. Lily is going to ask tonight if the rule worked for you. Victoria laughed softly under her breath, the sound surprising even herself. She typed a reply almost immediately. Then we should make sure I do not disappoint Lily. Daniel read the message and nodded as if the young girl were standing beside him approving the plan. The evening sky outside the garage had begun to fade into a deep blue as the first streetlights flickered on. Daniel typed one more message before locking up the shop for the night. Then the rule has only one step left. Victoria's fingers paused over the phone for a moment before she answered. And what step is that? Daniel looked toward the quiet street and typed the final line of the day. You say it again. I miss you. For a moment Victoria Hale did not move. The lights of the city shimmered behind her reflection in the glass window, and somewhere far away in a small Ohio town a mechanic had just reminded her once more that the simplest words in the world sometimes carried the greatest meaning. The evening settled quietly over both of their worlds as the final message of the day lingered on Victoria Hale's phone screen. You say it again. I miss you. The words were simple, almost childlike in their honesty. Yet for a moment they carried a weight that seemed larger than the skyline outside her window. Victoria stood motionless beside the glass wall of her office while the city lights flickered on one by one below her, like thousands of small reminders that life continued far beyond boardrooms and corporate strategies. In a modest Ohio town, Daniel Carter finished locking the garage and stepped into the cool evening air, the familiar sound of gravel beneath his boots echoing in the quiet parking lot. He placed his phone in his pocket and glanced up at the darkening sky, trusting that the message had reached the person who needed it most tonight. Back in the tower office, Victoria read the words again. The rule says you say it again. She sat down slowly in the leather chair behind her desk and rested her elbows on the polished wood surface. For years she had built her life around discipline and success, believing that strength meant always moving forward without pausing for the quiet parts of life. Yet tonight those quiet parts had found her anyway, delivered by mistake through a text message meant for a 9-year-old girl. Victoria lifted the phone once more and typed carefully, each word carrying more meaning than it might have in any business report or corporate memo she had ever written. I miss you too. The message traveled across the country just as the porch light flickered on outside Daniel Carter's small house. Daniel had just stepped inside after picking Lily up from her grandmother's place down the street. The young girl kicked off her sneakers by the door and ran toward the living room, her laughter filling the house in the easy way children bring warmth into a quiet space. Daniel's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen and smiled when he saw the message. Lily noticed the smile immediately. "Daddy, did the rule work today?" Daniel knelt beside her and nodded. "Yes, it did. The rule worked very well today." Lily crossed her arms proudly, as if she had personally designed the entire system. "Good. Because rules only work when people follow them." Daniel chuckled softly and looked once more at the message from the woman who lived hundreds of miles away among the glass towers of a very different life. "I miss you too." He typed a simple reply before setting the phone aside for the evening. "Then the rule will continue tomorrow." In her office high above the glowing city streets, Victoria Hale read Daniel's final message of the night and allowed herself a quiet smile that no executive meeting had ever brought her before. Somewhere in Ohio, a father was helping his daughter believe that small promises mattered. And without planning it, that same promise had reached her as well. Sometimes life changes not through grand events or powerful decisions, but through the quiet kindness of a single moment sent by mistake. A mechanic texting his daughter. A chief executive learning a forgotten rule. Two very different lives connected by 4 simple words that reminded them both that even in the busiest world, the smallest acts of care can travel farther than anyone expects. And perhaps that leaves us with a question worth asking tonight. When was the last time you reminded someone that they matter to you? If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that remind us how powerful simple kindness can be.